Adam Schiff had just called Senator John Kennedy an embarrassment to the United States Senate, and he did it with the polished confidence of a man who believed the room had already chosen sides before the microphone even warmed up. He said it straight to the face of a senator with an Oxford education, a Vanderbilt law degree, and 4 decades of legal patience hidden beneath a Louisiana drawl that Schiff clearly mistook for weakness. That was the first mistake, because Kennedy had spent years letting people underestimate the glasses, the slow cadence, the dry jokes, the stories about catfish, his mama, and old men from Louisiana who somehow understood human nature better than most committee lawyers understood their own subpoenas. Schiff walked into that hearing acting like Kennedy was a cable news caricature, a folksy prop, a porch-sitting punchline with a Senate pin, someone whose entire political value could be reduced to one-liners and rural charm. But what Schiff did not calculate was that Kennedy had not been performing innocence for 7 years. He had been watching, storing, measuring, and waiting like a lawyer who knew the witness would eventually get careless. Kennedy had watched Schiff move through the national stage with the solemn face of a man carrying secrets too grave for ordinary voters to inspect, and he had watched him do it again, and again, and again, until repetition started wearing the costume of proof. He had watched Schiff talk about evidence, hint at evidence, imply evidence, widen evidence, shrink evidence, and keep the word alive long after the public had been forced to rely on trust instead of verification. That was the rot underneath the performance, because Schiff was not just another partisan guest throwing elbows on a Sunday panel. He had chaired the House Intelligence Committee, sat behind classified walls, and spoken from an office most Americans were told to respect without ever being allowed to audit. Kennedy understood that distinction better than Schiff wanted him to, because when a politician uses classified access to sell public certainty, the voter is not debating evidence anymore. The voter is being asked to kneel before an institution. Schiff believed he was insulting a performer, but Kennedy understood the insult for what it really was. An invitation to put the man who claimed to own the facts onto a witness stand of his own making. The hearing itself was supposed to be dry enough to disappear into the archive by dinner. The kind of institutional theater built around oversight authority, intelligence accountability, classification abuse, and the fragile public trust that survives only when powerful people do not treat secrecy as a campaign asset. It was not supposed to become a confrontation that ripped through political media, not supposed to turn into the clip that exposed how quickly moral seriousness can curdle into self-protection when the wrong man starts asking the right questions. Schiff entered with the cold precision of a man trained by Stanford, Harvard Law, impeachment drama, House intelligence hearings, and years of television producers treating his every sentence like a breaking constitutional emergency. He reminded the room who he was, what titles he had held, what institutions he had served, and why Kennedy's Country Lawyer Act, as Schiff framed it, was supposedly beneath the dignity of the Senate. Then he delivered the line that changed the temperature of the room, asking what Kennedy had really done besides tell jokes. And for a moment, Schiff's side of the gallery looked ready to applaud the funeral, before realizing the body in the room was not Kennedy's. Kennedy did not answer at once, because men who know how to cross-examine do not rush toward a bad witness when the witness has just volunteered something useful. He cleaned his glasses slowly, deliberately, with the calm rhythm millions of Americans had seen before, and the pause itself became part of the indictment, because Schiff's insult had to sit there naked, unsupported, without Kennedy rescuing it with an emotional reaction. The room leaned forward, and that was exactly where Kennedy wanted it, because silence has a way of making arrogance louder than any rebuttal ever could. Then Kennedy brought up Boudreaux, a catfish farmer outside Breaux Bridge, a man who had spent 30 years around muddy water and still seemed to understand politics better than the people who wore expensive suits and called it public service. Boudreaux, Kennedy said, had one rule. When a man tells you who he is, believe him the first time, At first, the line sounded harmless, almost warm, almost like the old Kennedy routine Schiff had just mocked, but the trap was already closing before Schiff had time to see the hinge. Kennedy said Schiff had just told the room exactly who he was, a man who led impeachments, chaired intelligence, appeared on television hundreds of times, claimed evidence of Russian collusion, and was later censured by his own colleagues for misleading the American people. That was when the first layer peeled off, because Kennedy did not reject the storyteller frame. He accepted it, walked inside it, and turned it into a weapon sharper than any shouted accusation. Yes, Kennedy told stories, mostly funny ones about Louisiana, fish ponds, old friends, and people who did not need a Harvard degree to know the difference between a fact and a fish story. But then he drew the line Schiff had spent years avoiding. The difference, Kennedy said, was that his stories were meant to be funny, while Schiff's stories were meant to be believed. And what came next was not going to be a joke at all, because buried under those television appearances was a record Schiff had counted on the room for getting. Kennedy did not raise his voice when he turned to Schiff's television career, because raising his voice would have made the exchange look like politics, and Kennedy wanted it to feel like evidence being entered into the record. Between March 2017 and June 2023, he said, Schiff had made more than 400 television appearances across the major political platforms, not as a reluctant public servant dragged in front of cameras by national duty, but as a man who knew exactly how to feed the machine and keep the suspicion breathing. 400 appearances in roughly 330 weeks was not a slip of the tongue, not one careless phrase on one bad morning, not a man answering a question too quickly after a long day. That was a schedule, a system, a disciplined media operation with producers, booking calls, friendly anchors, repeat phrasing, and an audience conditioned to hear certainty, even when the evidence remained behind walls they were not allowed to enter. Kennedy made the arithmetic sound almost insulting in its simplicity, because that was the point. When a claim appears every week for years, it stops behaving like a claim and starts occupying the public mind like weather. That was where Kennedy began tightening the frame, because Schiff had not merely appeared on television as some ordinary partisan with an opinion and a microphone. He had been chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, a man who could walk into classified spaces, read briefings the public could not see, sit through testimony ordinary voters would never hear, and then come back out under studio lights with the grave face of someone carrying hidden truth. Kennedy understood exactly how dangerous that arrangement becomes when ambition slips into the gap between secret knowledge and public ignorance. The American people could not walk into a SCIF and check Schiff's wording, could not demand the transcript in real time, could not interrupt a Sunday show and ask whether evidence meant proof, suspicion, inference, gossip, political hope, or a carefully rehearsed fog. So they were asked to trust him, and Kennedy's accusation was brutally plain. Schiff had treated that trust not as a burden, but as a blank check. Kennedy called it narrative migration, and the phrase landed because it described what viewers had felt for years, without always knowing how to name it. Sometimes Schiff talked about direct evidence, sometimes more than circumstantial evidence, sometimes evidence in plain sight, sometimes a pattern so obvious that only bad faith could deny it, and each version moved just enough to survive the last disappointment. The fish got bigger when the cameras were friendly, smaller when the reports came due, and then somehow the conversation shifted until nobody was supposed to remember the original size of the fish at all. Kennedy was not accusing Schiff of being dramatic for one afternoon. He was accusing him of learning how to imply more than he could prove, while keeping enough institutional vocabulary around the claim to make skepticism look irresponsible. That was the real weapon, because once a public official makes doubt sound like disloyalty, the debate is no longer about evidence. It is about obedience. Then Kennedy brought the investigations into the room, not with fury, but with the dry patience of a man stacking receipts while the other side keeps hoping the audience will lose count. The Mueller investigation had consumed years: lawyers, FBI agents, warrants, subpoenas, interviews, and millions in taxpayer money. And after all of that, it did not deliver the criminal conspiracy Schiff had spent years teaching the country to expect. The Durham investigation came after that, and the institutional fog only looked worse because the grand structure Schiff had helped sell did not stand taller under scrutiny. It looked thinner, more political, more dependent on repetition than proof. Kennedy did not need to call Schiff a fraud in that moment, because the contrast was already doing the work. 400 appearances, years of claims, multiple investigations, one formal censure, and still the same old escape routes being repainted as seriousness. Schiff reached for one of those escape routes almost on instinct, leaning toward the familiar line that the Mueller report did not exonerate. But Kennedy cut him off before the phrase could become another hiding place. "Senator, you've had 400 turns to talk. Let me have one." The room broke open because the line was funny, but it was not only funny, and that was why it hit with such force. In one sentence, Kennedy compressed 7 years of media dominance into one interrupted moment, and suddenly Schiff's attempt to reclaim the rhythm looked less like a defense and more like a reflex from a man used to having every panel, every camera, and every moral emergency arranged around his voice. Kennedy did not linger on the laugh, because a weaker politician would have milked it until the joke became the story, and Kennedy was not there to win a comedy segment. The joke was only the door, and once the door opened, he walked the hearing toward something colder than television appearances, something recorded, visible, and impossible to bury inside tone. That was when September 2019 started moving toward the center of the room, not as some distant procedural memory, but as the next exhibit in a pattern Schiff had spent years pretending was just partisan resentment. Kennedy nodded toward the screen, and everyone understood that the hearing had left the soft ground of interpretation and was about to enter the harder territory of footage, transcripts, and words that had either been said or had not been said. What waited there was not merely another bad clip, not just an embarrassing flourish from a politician too comfortable in front of cameras, but a question about whether the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee had used the authority of his chair to make fiction sound like evidence. And once that video began to play, Schiff would no longer be defending a tone, a phrase, or a memory. He would be defending the moment when he read invented words into the record and then tried to escape through the back door marked parody. The footage did not need dramatic music because the damage was already sitting inside the frame. There was Schiff in the chairman's position, speaking with the practiced gravity of a prosecutor unveiling the moral center of a case. Reading a version of President Trump's call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that sounded crude, transactional, and politically explosive. But Kennedy's point was not that Schiff had been colorful, not that he had summarized too aggressively, not that he had taken ordinary political license in a noisy public fight. His point was sharper than that. Those words were not in the transcript, not in that form, not in that structure, not with that tone of invented dialogue presented from the authority of the Intelligence Committee chair. Schiff had written fiction, delivered it under institutional lighting, and only after the actual transcript made the invention impossible to ignore did he retreat behind the word parody. Kennedy understood comedy too well to let Schiff borrow it like a getaway car. Parody works when the audience understands the contract, when everyone knows the speaker is exaggerating, twisting, mocking, or making a point with obvious distance from the record. A man in a feed store saying Boudreaux caught a catfish the size of a Buick is parody because nobody is filing a subpoena over the Buick. Nobody believes the doc had to be reinforced, and nobody mistakes the joke for sworn testimony. But when the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee reads invented lines in a nationally watched hearing, with the seriousness of office wrapped around every syllable, the audience is not being invited into a joke. The audience is being asked to trust that the man with access to hidden information is giving them something close enough to truth to carry the weight of accusation. That was where Kennedy drove the blade deeper, because this was no longer about Schiff's personality, his style, or whether he liked television a little too much. It was about the abuse of institutional distance, the space between what powerful people can see and what ordinary citizens are forced to take on faith. The public could not instantly audit the classified context, could not walk into the committee room after the cameras shut off, could not compare every classified hint against every public sentence. They had to trust the office, and Schiff had used that office to make performance sound like evidence. A chairman cannot claim the moral seriousness of intelligence oversight on Monday, then claim comedic license on Tuesday, when the words turn out not to be there. Kennedy's line landed because it exposed the absurdity without needing to inflate it. He was supposed to be the funny one in the building, and Schiff was supposed to be the serious one. But somehow, the funny senator had kept his jokes labeled as jokes, while the serious chairman had read fiction from the dais and called it accountability. That reversal hit harder than outrage, because it made the room laugh at the exact place Schiff needed reverence. Anger can be dismissed as partisan noise, but laughter tells the audience that the costume has slipped. Schiff had tried to mock Kennedy as a performer, and Kennedy had calmly placed the performer's mask back onto Schiff's face. Then, Kennedy lowered the temperature, which made the next turn more dangerous. He moved to January 20th, 2025, the final day of President Biden's administration, when the machinery of power was already being packed into boxes, and the last official acts carried the strange smell of urgency. Among those final acts, Kennedy said, was a preemptive pardon for Schiff and other members of the January 6th Select Committee. Not a pardon after conviction, not a pardon after charges, not a pardon after a trial where evidence had been tested and guilt or innocence had passed through the ordinary fire of law. A pardon before any formal criminal accusation had been filed, which meant the question did not need to be shouted to sound dangerous. Kennedy was careful there, and that carefulness made the attack more lethal. He did not say that a pardon was legal proof of guilt because he knew better, and because the argument did not require that shortcut. He asked the question any adult in the country could understand without a law degree. Why does a man who insists he did nothing wrong need legal protection for charges that have not yet arrived? Ordinary people do not usually buy an umbrella before anyone sees rain unless they know something about the clouds. And in politics, a last-day pardon is not just a legal instrument. It is a message written in constitutional ink. Kennedy brought Boudreaux back because Boudreaux had a way of making Washington's strangest evasions sound ridiculous in plain English. Boudreaux was no lawyer, Kennedy said, but even Boudreaux understood that if a man walks into an attorney's office asking for protection against crimes nobody has accused him of committing, the first question is not congratulations. The first question is, what exactly did you do? Kennedy let that question hang across the table, because the silence after it carried more suspicion than any speech could have. Schiff kept his palms flat, his face controlled, his posture disciplined, but the cameras had already caught what Kennedy wanted them to catch. A man defending not one episode, but a pattern. And that pattern was about to become darker, because Kennedy had not yet reached the allegation that came from inside Schiff's own committee world. The next file did not come from a Republican campaign, a conservative host, or some anonymous online rumor, and that was exactly why Schiff could not laugh it off as partisan theater. Kennedy moved next to the allegation that, in his framing, made every earlier excuse sound thinner than paper. He pointed to the declassified testimony tied to a Democratic whistleblower who had worked inside the House Intelligence Committee world for more than a decade. Someone described not as a Republican operative, not as a conservative media personality, not as a campaign consultant looking for a book deal, but as a staffer from the very institutional neighborhood Schiff had spent years presenting as sacred ground. That mattered because Schiff's usual defense system depended on turning every criticism into partisan smoke, every question into MAGA theater, every demand for proof into an attack on democracy itself. But this was different, because Kennedy stripped away that escape hatch before Schiff could reach for it. a Democratic whistleblower, a longtime committee figure, an allegation under oath, a claim involving classified information and political damage. The man who had spent years presenting himself as the guardian of the Republic was now being described, from inside the machinery he once controlled, as someone who may have treated classified material like another weapon in the same political war he claimed to be defending the country from. Kennedy did not pretend that an allegation was a conviction, because that would have weakened the argument and given Schiff a clean technical answer. Instead, he focused on what Schiff did next, because behavior after exposure often tells the room what formal language tries to hide. Schiff did not march into the public square with a full line-by-line rebuttal, did not demand an immediate hearing to clear the record, did not invite scrutiny with the confidence of a man who had nothing to fear. He established a legal defense fund, and Kennedy let that fact sit in the room without decoration, because some facts become more damaging the less you dress them up. A politician can survive an insult, a bad headline, even a formal rebuke. But when the investigator becomes the investigated, and the man who built a career asking questions starts raising money so lawyers can help him answer his own, the ground has clearly shifted. Then, Kennedy tied the pieces together with the patience of a prosecutor who knows the jury has finally stopped looking at the witness and started looking at the pattern. 400 television appearances claiming evidence. One invented version of a presidential call read from the chairman's seat. One formal censure by the House. One preemptive pardon issued in the final hours of an administration. One whistleblower allegation from inside Schiff's committee world. One legal defense fund, and still the same number standing at the center of the table. 0. 0 evidence that matched the certainty Schiff had sold. 0 proof strong enough to carry the narrative he repeated for years. 0 humility when the record failed to rise to the level of his television voice. Kennedy repeated Schiff's credentials first, not to flatter him, but to remove every excuse. Stanford, Harvard Law, impeachment manager, intelligence chairman, a man trained in words, process, evidence, and consequence. This was not an amateur stumbling into one bad phrase. This was a professional who knew exactly how much weight the public would place on his title, and how hard it would be for ordinary citizens to check what he implied. That was why Kennedy returned to the storyteller frame, because that was where Schiff had started the fight, and where Kennedy intended to bury it. Kennedy admitted he told stories. Stories about Boudreaux, Louisiana ponds, his mama, old neighbors, catfish, sweet tea, and people who did not need a national security briefing to understand when a man was selling them something that smelled wrong. But Kennedy's stories came with the contract of humor. The audience knew the rhythm, knew the exaggeration, knew nobody was supposed to subpoena the catfish or measure the boat. Schiff's stories carried a different contract entirely. They came wrapped in institutional seriousness, delivered with the tone of classified knowledge, repeated across friendly cameras until suspicion became atmosphere, and atmosphere became a substitute for proof. Kennedy's distinction cut clean because it named the difference between comedy and fraud without needing to shout. And by the time Schiff tried to revive the old phrases about threats, democracy, Russia, and gravity, the room had already heard the mechanism behind the words. Kennedy's voice dropped, and the folksy surface slipped back just enough for the Oxford-trained, Vanderbilt-schooled lawyer to stand fully visible behind the drawl. He said Mueller had not produced what Schiff sold. Durham had not produced what Schiff sold. The Inspector General had not rescued what Schiff sold, and Schiff's own colleagues had censured him for misleading the American people. The only person still trying to keep the old story alive was Schiff, and even Schiff now needed a pardon and a defense fund to keep standing under its weight. For a few seconds, the machine stalled, not because Schiff had never been attacked before, but because this attack did not merely call him wrong. It showed the audience how the story had been built, repeated, monetized, protected, and repackaged every time the proof failed to arrive. That silence was the sound of a talking point losing its shelter. Then, Kennedy put his glasses back on and reached for the last line, the one the room had been trained by then to expect, but still was not ready to absorb. He asked what Boudreaux would say at a moment like this, and the pause stretched long enough for Schiff's entire public persona to sit there with nowhere elegant to go. Then, Kennedy gave it to him. "That was a hell of a fish story, Senator, but the fish ain't biting anymore." He did not stay to argue, did not chase applause, did not turn the victory into noise, because the cleanest image was Schiff still seated, while Kennedy walked away and left the phrase behind, like evidence nobody could redact. The laughter that followed was not cheap, it was recognition. The sound of people realizing that a story repeated long enough can still collapse the moment someone finally names it correctly. The clips moved because each one captured a different layer of the demolition. Mine were meant to be funny. Yours were meant to be believed, gave the audience the moral frame. You've had 400 turns to talk, gave them the cultural punchline, and the fish ain't biting anymore gave them the verdict they could repeat without needing a committee binder. The hearing was not really about catfish, not really about jokes, and not even only about Adam Schiff. It was about what happens when public trust is overused, overplayed, overfished, and then treated as if voters are too distracted to notice the bait stopped working. Schiff opened by calling Kennedy an embarrassment to the Senate, but Kennedy ended by making that insult look like projection with better lighting, because the man mocked as a storyteller brought the receipts, while the man famous for evidence brought one more story.